Hello, I'm Paul Gates, and welcome to the Academics. I'm here today with Dr. Michael Wade of the App State History Department and Dr. Dave Spiceland of the Appalachian State Department of Communication. Today on the Academics, we'll be discussing the concern over a second Cold War between the United States and Russia, the future of the GOP after a divisive election, and ask, has this election weakened faith in the American electoral system or inflamed it? So let's start with alleged Russian meddling in the election. We don't normally see foreign governments playing any role in our elections, but there's concern that the Russians are monkeying around with voter rolls and so forth this time around. What do we think?
Well, the suspicion's clearly there. Was not the WikiLeaks fellow first in Moscow before he decamped to, where is he now, Belgium?
There's an Ecuadorian embassy or something?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, he's in London at a...
An embassy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right,
okay.
Right.
So, yeah, who knows? It's the timing seems suspicious, but...
Well, it's not just WikiLeaks either. It's, there's talk about, the voter rolls in Arizona and Illinois being hacked into, and...
Good argument for paper ballots.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, well, there's a difference, though, between hacking into the system where voter registrations are stored and influencing the actual vote or reducing or inflating the actual vote. That's
could be two sides of the same coin. The reason I said paper ballots is, why have a system that's at risk from anyone at any time when paper ballots ordinarily have done just fine?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's my concern too. Is the data somehow being shared on the internet, and if so, why? I don't see a reason for that, but apparently somebody is, like you said, monkeying around. Could it be the Chinese? Could it be see, I want to keep saying the Soviets, because even though they're Russians and they don't have the Soviet empire, it seems like they still think like Soviets. They still have this paranoid kind of expression, and they don't like us for a lot of reasons.
Two things. One, I think the WikiLeaks situation is yet another distraction from what ought to be the real issues of the election, but we'll probably come to that later in the program. And the second thing is it might well be more appropriate to say that the Soviets thought like Russians, and the Russians are doing what they've always done. There is a strain of paranoia in Russian history that goes back at least to the Mongol invasion in 1237, and Putin is, among other things, the latest reflection of that paranoia. Is he an expansionist, or is he doing what Russia traditionally has done, which is to try to exert control over its borders, both Western and Eastern? Yeah, it's worth noting the Soviet Union always had more troops on the Chinese border during the Cold War than it ever did on the Western Front.
Dave?
A lot of saber rattling. You've got a guy, Mr. Putin, who was in power, then he got out of power, and he liked power, so he got back into power. I don't know. You need to be aware, not you, but we as a country need to be aware that, love all, trust few, and always paddle your own canoe.
Putin's a I'm glad you said that, Dave. Putin's a continuum in another way. He's back in. the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, we imagined that that represented a victory for democracy and capitalism, and thought that flooding Russia with a lot of money, as well as the Eastern Bloc, would result in all kinds of good things. What it resulted in was massive thievery, the resurgence of organized crime in Russia, and Putin is partly the result of that, not so much the organized crime, but he is the end product of that 25-year process. What does he have to offer the what does he have to offer the Russian people other than I'm going to protect the Russian patrimony as we define it? What else? It's a hopelessly corrupt and oligarchical system. It may not be communist, but it's very much in the Russian tradition.
Well, we hear a lot about Putin seeking to restore the greater Russia and to its former glory. And does that attitude play into what is going on with the American election? Is there a connection there?
Oh, I think that's one of the things Putin, if that's what's happening, that's one of the things he has to offer the Russian people. It won't bring them prosperity. It won't put much on the table, and it won't percolate down very far into the Russian populace.
So then, does it cement his authority and while diminishing our system?
There's always the promise of, when I was in the Soviet Union a long time ago, '82, we saw these grandiose plans for the 5-year plan. And every year it was another 5-year plan and another 5-year plan. And there's always this hope that someday we're going to make it. And it's a third world country. It was a third world country when I was visiting there. And there's that famous picture of this tourist with a camera around his neck meeting Ronald Reagan. And apparently it was Putin. And he was cast as a tourist, a Russian tourist, visiting, this American leader. He was a KGB agent. So he comes out of that whole KGB kind of mentality.
That was a great question. The greatest threat to our system is internal.
Well, okay, that's a good segue into voter turnout, another dimension of the election. With Hillary leading the polls, we continue to see unrest from the right and the disillusioned left, perhaps. Has this election lessened faith in the democratic system?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I talk to people who say, I just don't want to vote. And people who talk about, I'll vote, but then I'll take a shower afterwards. That kind of, it's a very dirty kind of feeling, I guess, holding your nose, going to the polls. But like I said several weeks ago, I heard some of the same kind of talk back in 1960. I think there's always been this love-hate relationship with the voting system. Is it worse this time? Yeah, I think it is. But I think that a lot of what's going on with both campaigns, and I'm excluding the Libertarians and the Green Party, it's designed to discourage voter turnout on the other side. It's driving up negatives. It's Hillary is horrible, Trump is horrible, so therefore the other side shouldn't vote because we're going to win anyway.
Does it? You think it's going to work that way, Mike, or is we've been hearing about the hold your nose and vote since the primaries. I mean, that was going on in the primaries. But is this actually going to work that way to depress turnout in the general election, or is it going to? Some people are going to decide who is the evil of two lessers, and then vote perhaps against somebody because they dislike them even more. Or does it work the way Dave's cast it?
I agree with Dave that I think it's been demoralizing. I have no idea what the turnout will be. What is apparent is that the real issues that this country needs to face were only engaged early on by Bernie Sanders. I think there are a lot of people in the Tea Party who may have some of the same instincts, but as long as the issues aren't being engaged, there's no possibility of anybody coming together to talk about take the government back from whom exactly. That would be a good conversation because it's not really, we don't really have a functioning republic at this point. You know, I worry less about who's going to, whether the ballot boxes might, figuratively speaking, might get tinkered with, than with all of these PACs and their candidates controlling the agenda with their television ads, and none of it is about what's real. You know, the future of this country is going to go to, can we come up with an economic system that's sustainable, a planet that's habitable? Can we manage our population? Issues of national security that really haven't been well defined for the 21st century.
Well, Dave, take a shot at, is voter turnout going to
It depends. It depends on if you get your base out.
Yeah.
I'm hearing, and this is anecdotally, that Florida pre-voting, early voting or whatever is up, but who knows? It just kind of depends on who you talk to and who you're listening to. Are you bringing them out? Are you scaring them more? And going back to the, I really wish we could talk sometime about the spots, because that's where I ask my students, how many of you have ever met, the candidates? And of course, nobody has. So we meet them by watching these videos on television. There's a lack, I think, of transparency when we see Citizens for a Better North Carolina. And that's somewhat what I've seen. Who are these people?
Right.
And if you do a Google search, a lot of times you won't find who they are. Are they left, right, Republican, Democrat, senatorial committee or whatever? Although those committees tend to be pretty upfront about who they are. So we need, in my humble opinion, more transparency. I don't mind third party or third groups having a say. I think that's a free speech issue. But you ought to tell us who you are, and a lot of times I don't think they do.
I don't know. That's the dark money issue that we hear a lot about. And of course, talking about the spots, as much as ever, I won't say more than ever, all the spots are negative. You don't see any why you should vote for this candidate. It's what's wrong with the other candidate. Any hope for changing that?
But I do see some Hillary spots where she talks about stronger together. I think that's her mantra.
Her little slogan, yeah.
Yeah,
right,
and I see some positive things, some positive images. I see some by Trump, but yeah, indeed, it's the negativity about the other candidate.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that the candidates don't tell us who they are either. Those debates, for example, are pseudo events. They're not real. They're not even a real debate format. But beyond that, I mean, they are like we are here today. They are participating and we are watching a mediated event. It's as Dave said, we're not talking to the candidates, they're not talking to us. So it's a staged event. The spots are most certainly staged events. And the end result is, back to Theodore Roosevelt, one of the things he's credited with, for better or worse, is that after him, presidents were forced to run on their records because he made the president the head of his party as well as simply the president. Where has that gotten to? Of course, neither of these candidates has ever been president, but they're not even running on the records of their own parties, by and large.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was going to say, that's an interesting campaign on his part. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt became president with the death of McKinley. But Mark Hanna, I think his name was, in Ohio, was behind the scenes with McKinley. And when Theodore Roosevelt became president, and he was the VP apparently to keep him from being president, and then when McKinley was shot, somebody saw Hanna on a train and he was looking very despondent. And he said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "You know, that blankety-blank cowboy is now president." People still, I'm sure, controlled Roosevelt in many ways, but he was one of those who sort of broke out from that kind of control by some of the folks, Hanna and others.
Actually, it's true that the story about Hanna is true. He said, "That damn cowboy's president." Roosevelt was nominated for the vice presidency because they were the Republican bosses were displeased with McKinley's first vice president, whose name escapes me, and the political boss of New York, Thomas Platt, was extraordinarily displeased with Theodore Roosevelt, who had come back from the Spanish-American War and won the governorship of New York, and thought that he was in charge of New York State, which Platt differed with. So he and Hanna and others cut a deal. We'll get rid of McKinley's first vice president, and we'll also get rid of Theodore Roosevelt in New York. McKinley is a relatively young and healthy man, and we will just disappear him into the vice presidential closet. Didn't happen.
So we've got parties unhappy from within. We're reaching back 100 years now. And this is what we're seeing now. What of the political right in the United States? I mean, are we going to have one GOP later after this is all over, or are we permanently fractured? We got the
1964, after Goldwater's trouncing, and everybody predicted the end of the Republican Party. It didn't happen. There were things that happened, well, particularly the Vietnam War is going on. I think we'll always have at least two parties. In fact, the Electoral College is one of the things that it's designed for, is to keep a two-party system, so that we don't, if we didn't have the Electoral College, we may have more 3, 4, 5 parties at play.
Sure.
So no, I don't think it's dead. It's going through some machinations and changes or whatever.
Well, perhaps not dead, but broken into various wings.
That's always happened. GOP, they eat their young. There's always this sense of course, the Democrats do it too, but for some reason the GOP doesn't seem to get away with it. There's always this infighting or whatever, and apparently more so today, because you've got, like you said, the bosses who are not elected, who are determining candidates, have determined candidates, are not happy with Trump. So who knows?
The Republican Party, this time is different. The Republican Party historically has been the party of free market conservatives in business, particularly big business. But when they took in the segregationists in the late 60s and into the 70s, they also took in fundamentalists of a religious persuasion. Segregationists were more than just segregationists. They generally were anti-science. They were anti-government, largely because of the civil rights movement. And they were cultural conservatives. And cultural conservatives and free market conservatives don't always get along because free market conservatives are inclined to not want to use government except when it benefits them. Cultural conservatives are willing to use it on behalf of their legislating their beliefs, and that's the split today.
We used to hear a lot about the rational voter. You know, Thomas Kuhn, the well-known political scientist, would say that people voted rationally, and he would call these splinter groups anomalies. Well, it seems like the anomalies are growing in number and influence within the party. Is that true? Are we seeing more division
Oh, there is. I think the lines of that fracture are the ones I just described.
Right, but fractured from each other, not just different groups coming together in a party, but different groups going their own way within the party.
Tony Schwartz did political spots for Democrats, and he's the one that came up with the Daisy ad back in '64.
Yeah.
And he did one in '68 that I thought was very good. It was for McGovern. And you see a guy in a voting booth because there seems to be voting booth mentality for the serious voter. And he's thinking, you hear his thinking out loud, and he's looking at the different choices, Nixon, McGovern, you know, I'm a Republican, my dad would roll over in his grave, he's thinking all this, and he said, maybe this would work, and so he selects McGovern. And I thought that was a good example of what, and not everybody does that, but the person who is serious about their voting will go into the voting booth and maybe think about it. And I say the voting booth, I mean, that's antiquated, I know, but.
Two quick thoughts. One is that there are signs of fracture in the Democrats, too. Hillary Clinton's going to have to come through on her promises to the Sanders faction if she's elected. The other thing is that the people now running this country who are not elected need the continuing presence of two significant political parties. Otherwise, they can't continue the ruse that the country is a functional republic.
And going back to Sanders, though, I mean, there's a lot of Sanders people who are very unhappy because apparently the Democrat establishment and the Democratic Party did something, the WikiLeaks seems to point to this, to where Debbie Schultz was had to leave the party because apparently they did deny the party nomination to Sanders in some way. And there's a lot of Sanders voters who say, and this is the difference between what they say and what they do. You know, I'm not going to vote for Hillary. And you know, I hear people say, I'm not going to vote for Trump, Hillary, or whatever. But when they get in that voting booth, I say booth, but who knows? Because I've heard people say, I'm going to vote for Trump, but I'm not going to tell anybody. So the polls, and by the way, the polls apparently, who knows, at this recording session, that they seem to be tightening some. But who knows? We've got how many days at this point? 10, 11, or whatever. There's always these last minute, a few more October surprises.
You're talking about the rational voter, Dave, and we'll see if that really comes to pass.
And I'm not saying it happens a lot,
but people may be considering the issues when they get into that voting booth.
Rationalism's in short supply these days.
That may be true. That's our program. For the panel, I'm Paul Gates. We hope you'll join us next time on The Academics.